So today we're going to talk about small fruit production, and I got to figure out how I can get this to advance. There we go. So just to start off, and this will give us an opportunity to check. You can unmute yourself if you have something to add to this. So what do you want to learn today? What topics? And while you think about that for a minute, some years ago I was teaching a class like this on small fruits. It wasn't Master Gardener, it was another gardening set of classes. And after I had talked about strawberries and raspberries, one of the class members said, well, this isn't exactly what I was hoping for. I thought you were going to talk about small fruit trees. Oh, no, we're not talking about small fruit trees today. We're talking about berries primarily. So what do you want to learn today?
Personally, for me, I'd like to see what I did wrong the last time I tried to do grapes and raspberries, because I never got good yield from them. They just never took off like I had hoped.
Okay, we are going to talk about grapes and we're going to talk about raspberries. Who else?
I want blueberries to work. I'm a Seattle girl.
We'll talk about blueberries, but only briefly. I'm afraid I've got bad news for you.
Darn.
Anybody else?
Yeah, grapes, raspberries, how to prune them and all that.
Yeah, well, I hope before we're done today that you'll have a better handle on how to prune raspberries. I want to give you some confidence in that regard.
Can you hear me, Dr.
Yes.
Roper?
Yes.
I would like to, I've tried to grow berries in a lot of different ways, even like a big 40-gallon, I've got 2 blueberry bushes and 2 40-gallon tree containers. And it took me about 8 years to get my first berries, but at least they're green. But I was wondering if you could go over things like how to try to formulate the best soil mixture, such as azurite. Azurite's something that I've heard about. I even bought a sack of it just to give it a go, but I don't know whether it's any good or not. It's a mineral. So just anything on soil prep to try to, to get ahead of the situation with berries. I've tried blackberries, blueberries, dewberries, raspberries, everything, but just have mixed results.
Okay, thanks for sharing. That must be frustrating.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, I'm going to take just a moment
Michael, I just realized there are some people in the chat. I don't know if you want to read their comments.
Yep. So there's a few here. Fruiting raspberries, which was covered already, and specifically growing everbearing raspberries.
Okay.
Grapes and raspberries, and then what raspberry varieties to plant, and pruning care for them, and then using secondary water for raspberries, like well water.
Okay. Well, that gives me a good handle. I think we're going to cover everything that was on your list.
Oh, and then there's one here on how to keep the birds from getting to the grapes.
Yeah. Remind me if I don't get to that in the grapes. I don't have a slide on that, but we can certainly talk about that. Yeah. So small fruits that'll grow along the Wasatch Front, there are a number of them. We're going to begin with grapes. Grapes actually grow pretty well along the Wasatch Front. Then we'll talk about raspberries, strawberries. We'll talk about blackberries before strawberries. Spend just a moment talking about some other small fruit crops that you may have heard about: service berries, currants, gooseberries. And we will talk a little bit about blueberries, but you'll note the question mark under the blueberry. That's a questionable crop for our area. So as we begin, let me pose a question for you, and that question is, what do gardeners garden? And I'll give you a couple of hints here. Whoa, wrong one. So one option would be soil. Another option would be sunshine. Well, if you think about that for a minute, I don't know if Dr. Carden or others of our soil scientists have spoken to you yet, but certainly they'll tell you that gardeners garden soil. And I really don't want to minimize the importance of soil in the equation, but in the grand scheme of things, sunlight is what we really are gardening. What we do when we garden is we put out our plants and the leaves grow off of those plants and they capture the light energy from the sun, and through the miracle of photosynthesis, they turn that light energy then into chemical energy and then transform it into wonderful things that we like to eat, like grapes and raspberries and strawberries. Now, I've been at this long enough that I've had this question over and over again. And the question goes something like this: can I grow fill in the blank crop in partial shade? Well, being an academician, my answer needs to be a question, which is define grow. If you just want to grow the plant, then yeah, it'll probably survive in partial shade. But if you want high yields of high quality fruit, then shade is your enemy. And the more sunlight that your plants receive, the higher the yield and the higher the quality is going to be. So gardening is really all about sunlight. It's all about capturing sunlight. And with that in mind, we need to spend a minute talking about site selection. Now, for most of us, and we live where we live, we bought a property not based on gardening necessarily, but because we like the house, we like the location, was something that we could afford. And now we have to live within the constraints of the decision that we made. Some of that certainly has to do with climate, our midwinter cold, our midsummer heat, how windy it is, the length of the growing season, slope and elevation and aspect. Aspect is what direction your slope is. So let's delve into those. You've all seen this hardiness zone map. And the thing that you need to realize about the hardiness zone map is that it's based solely on the lowest expected winter temperatures. It says nothing about the length of the growing season. It says nothing about summer heat. It's only about how cold it's likely to get in the winter. So along the Wasatch Front, you're mostly zone 6. So minimum temperatures are in the -5 to 0 degrees Fahrenheit range. And I think that's a pretty fair estimation of the weather that is received along the Wasatch Front. But another thing to think about is the length of the growing season. Because I use roughly the same presentation in various places, here are 4 locations along the Wasatch Front that we'll just say are representative. So Brigham City, Farmington, Provo, BYU, and Salt Lake City at the University of Utah. I could have chosen the airport, but I really think that the University of Utah is a better estimation. If you looked at Google Earth and saw their elevation, all of these sites are roughly at the same elevation. So there certainly will be some variation based on your elevation compared to these. But if we look at the date of the last spring frost, that can be as early as mid to late March. We're already in that area, and these would be the record early. The median is typically late April to early May, but they can be as late as early June. If we look at the first fall freeze dates, when we're going to lose our crops in the fall, it can be as early September, usually about the 2nd to 3rd week of October, but as late as early November, or even close to Thanksgiving at the University of Utah. So if we look at that and do the math, our short growing season can be as short as 100 days, typically we're about 160 to 170 frost-free days, and some years as long as 200 to 225 frost-free days. Now, I have to admit, I put BYU and the University of Utah on there together because I was interested which university generates the most hot air. And it looks to me from this slide like BYU wins. And I'm a BYU alum, so I can say that. So if you think back to high school physics, you know that cold air settles and warm air rises, and that's why hot air balloons will float. So if we consider a slope being up on the slope or on the top, it's going to be warmer there than it would be in adjacent low areas. I grew up on the Orem bench back when there used to be orchards and not just houses. And one of the reasons that orchards were on the Orem bench is that the cold air could drain off of Orem down into Provo. So it would drain into the river bottoms on the east, onto Utah Lake on the west, and down into Provo proper to the south. So it was often a lot warmer in Orem than it would be in Provo. We can create artificial frost pockets, but with vegetation, fences, windbreaks, those kinds of things. So you'll see we'll have a frost pocket here above the trees, and of course the low places are frosty. Now, if you watch the TV weather and you look at the temperature for Logan, the official weather reporting location for Logan is at the airport, and that's pretty common. I think that's the same for Provo as well. And the Provo airport is right on the lake, and the Logan airport is right in the bottom of the valley. Now, from where I live, I can see the north end of the runway from the Logan airport from my house. So I'm not too far from it, but I'm a couple of 100 feet higher in elevation. And at my house, my thermometer outside usually reads 3 to 5 and even 7 degrees warmer at my home than it is at the airport. So elevation makes a huge difference. Now, we're okay here in Cache Valley with the official reporting station being the airport because, you know, the Wasatch Front people, they look at that and say, oh, Logan, it's way too cold. I don't know why anybody lives there. And so it keeps all the Wasatch Front riffraff from coming up into Cache Valley. But, you know, it's really not as cold where the people live as it is at the airport. To give you a demonstration of this, this is a Google Earth shot from Perry, Utah, so just south of Brigham City, and I-15 is to the left, and the way station is just a little bit south of where we are. And if you look at this orchard, you can kind of perceive some slope here in the upper part of the orchard that's shown in the middle of that photo. But as you look to the bottom part, you'll see a lot of dead and missing trees. And if you think about the construction of the freeway, there's probably a 10 to 12 foot elevation of the roadbed above the adjoining land. And so this has created a frost pocket. Air eventually will pile up there and then move across the freeway, but that's a frost pocket that was created by the construction of I-15. In terms of soils for berries, we'd like well-drained loamy soils, and by a loamy soil, I'm meaning a soil that is a combination of sand, silt, and clay, not too much in any of the directions. So if you happen to live, along Sand Hill Road, south of the UVU campus, that's pretty much blow sand, and that soil is going to take some amending. If you live in Vineyard, that soil typically is pretty heavy clay, particularly as you get closer to the lake. But you can deal with that. You can improve soil by adding organic matter, compost, barnyard manure, leaf litter, anything that you can get your hands on that is dead or decaying plant material will help to improve your soils. Now, when your home was built, I'm sure that the builder scraped off all the topsoil off of your property and then built your house, and then he sold most of that soil and put 3 or 4 inches back around your yard. So soil depth, we'd wish were deeper than that, but for the most part, we can deal with that kind of a soil situation. We'd like a pH around 7, but you won't have that anywhere. Our soil pHs in Utah are in the 8 to 8.5 range. Now, blueberries, they want a pH of about 4.5 to 5, maybe 5.5. Blueberries just will not grow in an alkaline soil. So that's the first key in blueberries, is that they have to have an acidic soil. And then we need to think about the saltiness of soils as well. And we're getting to that. So for most of us, we just turn on the tap and water comes out, and that water is pretty good quality. That's typically snowmelt water from the Central Utah projects, what most of you are seeing. And that water's, excuse me, it's not salty, but it's still reasonably high pH. So let's continue that salinity theme. This table, and you may not be able to decipher it, there's really only a couple of points I wish to make from it. Each column in the table shows what happens to the yield of these various fruit crops as the EC, the electrical conductivity, or the saltiness of a soil goes up. So if we look at the bottom row, and that's wheat, wheat starts just to kind of be unhappy with an electrical conductivity of 4.7 decisiemens per meter. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner at apple, at a comparable level of saltiness, apple is going to suffer a 50% loss. So just because wheat might grow in an area doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great place to grow fruit crops. Fruit crops are much more sensitive to salt than the agronomic crops are. One of our common mistakes in gardening is to begin too late. All the big box stores have seed packets there for sale now, and we look through the seed packets and think, oh, I'd like some of those, and so we buy them and bring them home, and then we may or may not have a great garden place prepared for that. So it's good to begin the year before planting, or at least the fall before. If you've not taken a soil test, it's really a good idea to do that every 5, 6, 7 years. And Michael and Ton can help you with that. And as you get a report back from the soil test lab, it will tell you the plant available phosphorus and potassium, and any fertilizer recommendation if that's needed. And pre-plant is the best time to put on phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, particularly phosphorus. Phosphorus fertilizer will just sit in the top layer of soil. And the only way to get it down into the root zone is through cultivation, a rototiller or spading to turn that soil over. So you can put the fertilizer out in the fall, you can work that into the soil, and then when you plant in the spring, that phosphorus fertilizer will be available for the plants down into the root zone. And of course, it takes time to add organic matter and get it well worked into the soil. You can do that in the spring, but again, adding organic matter is probably the single best thing that you can do to improve soil. I know you're all plant people. That's why you're in this Master Gardener program. And we love plants and we love to share plants, but I'm here to advocate not doing that. If we purchase plants from a reputable nursery, we'll get plant material that is true to name, that is disease-free, and that is virus indexed. That just means that it's free at the time you buy it of known harmful viruses. Utah has a viral disease of raspberries called raspberry bushy dwarf virus. It is pollen-borne, but pollinating insects are not the primary vector. Neighbors are. So we have a raspberry planting and we're narrowing the row, and we don't want to dig up those plants and just throw them away. And so we offer them to our neighbor. And along with our raspberry plants, we may share raspberry bushy dwarf virus with our neighbors as well. Where if we buy plants from a reputable nursery, it would be free of those viruses. And the same thing is true if it's time to rejuvenate the planting and start a new planting somewhere else. You want to buy new plants, not take the old plants, because you'll take all those problems with you from one location to the other. So I'm really here to advocate not saving plants, don't share them. Go to the nursery and get new plants. And the mail order nurseries really do a pretty good job of shipping at an appropriate time. They ship by zip code. So now we're going to go on and begin to talk about grapes. But before we do that, I wanted to see if there are any questions about what we've covered so far.
So Tara, we got a question here. Is the don't share plants policy related to small fruits, or does that include perennials and grasses as well?
Well, it is particular for small fruits, but really any of our plant material, I would say, a lot of our perennials, iris, for example, just are not very disease or insect prone. Go ahead and share your iris. One other thing to consider, though, is that some of our garden plants are patent protected. When we bought those plants initially, we paid a royalty fee when we bought them from the nursery. And I know they spread, and bearded iris are a really good example of that. But if you bought a named variety of bearded iris, particularly if it's the latest and greatest, it probably is patented. And if you share that with your neighbor, you're really in violation of those plant patent laws. So I'm very much an advocate of buying plants from a reputable nursery. And in the grand scheme of things, the cost of nursery stock is nominal. It's a minimal cost. And you'll end up with a much better situation by paying a few more dollars up front. Okay, let's go on and talk about grapes. We'll begin there. First, I want to give you an idea of the breadth of grapes. So they're in the genus Vitis, family Vitaceae. There is a broad array of grapes. Vitis vinifera are the European wine and table grapes. So these are native to the Mediterranean basin. So if you go to the grocery store, if you can find them right now and buy table grapes, green or red grapes, these are Vitis vinifera kinds. These are the grapes that are harvested in the fall and fermented into wine. These are not, well, they're probably not hardy in Utah. There are some that are hardier than others. Now, if you think of those green grapes that you bought at the grocery store, if you squeeze them, you'd squeeze juice out of them, but the insides and the skin are going to stay adhered to one another. And there are literally thousands of varieties of Vitis vinifera. And I've listed just a handful there. And I was going to say something about that, and now
Terrell, if you don't mind me adding just a note, we have Thompson Seedless here in Great Trial at Point, and it's pretty much only alive on one side of the building where it gets heat from the building and a lot of wind protection. So that's pretty typical of what we see of the vinifera type of grapes. I know in Kaysville, other trial that's there. White Pace is a similar thing with all of these more traditional European wine type grapes. And table grapes, they're just marginally winter hardy, and they really tend to struggle a lot. They may live, but a lot of times they die back to the ground and you never get fruit.
Thanks, Mike. And that's my experience as well. What I was going to say is that grapes are the most widely planted fruit crop in the world. There are more tons of grapes produced than any other fruit crop. Now, grapes with which you may be more familiar would be Vitis labrusca. These are the American bunch grapes or fox grapes. These are hardy. They're native to North America. And these are things like Concord, Delaware, Himrod, Niagara, things that have been grown in Utah for many, many years. And if you squeeze an individual berry, the skin will stick to your fingers and the insides squeeze out. So that's saying the exocarp separates. That's what we're communicating there. Some very clever breeders have made hybrids.
Terrell, just real quick, in the industry, if you're looking up information about the grapes online, they call it slip skin or non-slip skin.
Yeah.
So that's what you're seeing. That sometimes I see that in some of the literature, and it's like, well, but that's what it means that it's the slip skin. That skin separates from the pulp, and then you're left with kind of two pieces of the grape.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So there are hybrids between the two. These are hardier than vinifera. They're disease and insect resistant. And again, they are slip skin then. And there are many, many, many varieties of these with a range of hardiness. They have better quality for making wine than Labrusca, but maybe not as good as vinifera. So if wine grapes are your thing, the French-American hybrids is what you need to be looking for. And again, there are hundreds of cultivars. There was a grape breeder, he worked in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Elmer Swenson was his name. He's deceased now. But he released 20 or 30 different hybrid grapes. And if they're hardy in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they'll be hardy along the Wasatch fronts. Another type of grape, just for completeness, is Vitis rotundifolia. These are commonly called muscadine grapes. These are native to the southeastern U.S., Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They grow off wild in the woods. They're really cold tender, and they won't survive in northern Utah. So you can just give up on that. I just want to let you know that those exist. So what kind of frost-free period do we need? For the American grapes, the Labrusca types, about 150 to 160 days. So most years along the Wasatch Front, these will grow just fine. And most of the French hybrids, but not all of them. 170 to 180 days, these would be the early maturing vinifera grapes and the French hybrids. 180 plus days for some of the Europeans, the later harvest ones, and then 200 frost-free days for the muscadine. So you see, we're just never going to be able to grow these. Now, this frost-free days doesn't say anything about the midwinter cold, and that clearly is a problem for the vinifera type grapes. So in vinifera, when we get 0 to -10, we'll get bud injury. If we get below -10, the vines will be injured. The hybrids are intermediate. And the American types, -20, will cause some crop reduction, but the vines will come through just fine. So they're very winter hardy. And just as an aside, while we've got this up here, the vinifera, of course, are native to the Mediterranean basin, so Europe, North Africa, western parts of the Middle East. And the Labrusca types are native to North America. And in the 1800s, we were kind enough to export some of our grapes to Europe. And along with that, we sent a little midge called grape phylloxera. And it devastated the European wine grape industry because the vinifera had never seen grape phylloxera. The American grapes had. They had co-evolved, and phylloxera just doesn't cause us any problem in those. But it really devastated the European industry. So now all the grapes in Europe are grafted with a Labrusca rootstock and a vinifera scion. Well, let's talk about the parts of a grapevine. The trunk is the main vertical stem, and that's permanent. The head is the area at the top of the trunk and maybe some little short upper arms. So that's one way to train them. Cordons would be horizontal extensions of the trunk, and these are perennials, permanent to semi-permanent. The cane is a mature woody shoot that is 1 year old. A shoot is green growth from a bud on the cane, and that has leaves. That's where the fruit are born, and that's current season growth. Opposite a leaf on some of the upper nodes rather, on a shoot, you'll find tendrils, and that's how the cane or the shoot attaches itself to the structure, I'll come up with the word. And spurs are cane prunes, just 4 or fewer nodes. So they're short canes that are renewal spurs. Cluster would be a group of flowers and or a group of fruit. The buds on grapevines are compound buds that contain both vegetative and reproductive structures. And we'll talk more about buds in just a minute. So we can look at the parts of the grapevine here. Here's the trunk going up and down. The head is at the top of the trunk. The cordons are extending either side out of the head area. And then shoots or canes are arising from the cordon. Rootstock below ground as well. Of course, we've got leaves and our grape clusters as well. So at the risk of beating this to death, here's a 1-year-old cane at the top of this picture. Coming from that is a current season shoot. From that shoot, in this case, you see at nodes 2, 3, and 4, we have clusters of grapes. And you can see the tendrils, and the tendrils are opposite a leaf at a given node. Here's a grape shoot. Fruit are possible only at nodes 1 through 8. So we're counting them here. 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this picture have clusters coming. So one bud on the cane will produce 1 shoot. So you want 30 to 40 shoots per plant, and then 1 to 2 clusters per shoot. You want to hold on to that. Remember this, because when we talk about pruning, hopefully that will begin to make more sense to you. So again, here on the left, we have a 1-year-old cane and a current season shoot. Now that grape cane may have many nodes, and those are the buds. Some of those nodes may be fruitful or not. And generally, the basal nodes on those canes are most likely to produce fruiting shoots. And we'll come back to this, as I'm saying at the bottom. Where the fruitful cane nodes are varies by the species. Lower nodes on vinifera and higher number nodes on the labrusca. So here's our 1-year-old cane. Whoop, got ahead of myself. 1-year-old cane, and we see the current season shoots arising off of that 1-year-old cane. Buds. As I said before, the grape bud is a mixed bud. It has both vegetative and reproductive structures. It's also a compound bud with primary, secondary, and tertiary buds within that bud structure. The primary bud will produce vegetative growth and fruit. If the primary bud is damaged for any reason, the secondary bud will produce maybe 1 cluster, but vegetative growth. If the secondary bud is also damaged, then the tertiary bud would begin to grow and there would be no fruit, but new shoots would arise from that. And this picture just shows the death of the primary bud that's in the middle due to low winter temperatures. In the spring, pretty soon we'll start seeing this happen. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a bud that is still dormant. And then as we go down, we'll see the buds begin to swell. New shoots will begin to emerge from the bud at each node. So here we see the vegetative structures, and it continues to grow. And now as the shoot elongates, the flower primoria begin to be obvious. We see here the flower primoria in the middle, and then we go into flowering in the upper right-hand frame, and then on to berries. So that's the development through the season of that primary bud. So again, here's our cane, here's our shoot, and the clusters are born on the shoot. Grape flowers are small. They're about 1/8 of an inch across. They don't have showy petals. And the reason for that is they're wind pollinated. There's no reason to spend your energy growing petals if you don't need to attract insects. There are 5 sepals, petals, and stamens, have a superior ovary, 2 locules with 2 ovules per locule. Now, the cultivated grapes have perfect flowers, but in other areas of the world, sometimes we'll see grapes that are growing along a fence line, often rural areas, and sometimes those have male and female plants. And people sometimes collect those indiscriminately, and they get male plants. They produce flowers, but they never produce fruit. So a diagram of our grape flower. beginning at the left, covered with the calyptra, and these are really just fused petals. But as the flower is ready to open, the calyptra falls off, and this is the flower that we're really seeing. So you see 2 locules with 2 ovules per locule.
Hey, Terrell, can I
Yeah.
just pass forth a question? The question is it possible that having trees in a slight frost pocket could delay blossoming in a way that would be beneficial for surviving late frost?
So I'm not sure I got the question, Michael. Let me repeat what I heard. So if you have grapevines in a frost pocket, you can keep
Or just fruit trees in general, or just fruit generally? If they're in a frost pocket, is there any way that would be beneficial in delaying bloom time so that it would avoid freezing?
Unfortunately, no. Typically what happens in that case is when it's warm, it's equally warm in a frost pocket as to areas that are higher up. But then overnight, the frost pocket gets colder and gets colder faster than adjacent but higher areas. So during the daytime, there's not much of a temperature differential, but at nighttime there is. So those frosty places generally develop at about the same rate, but then they're more susceptible to cold overnight.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So here's a great flower. Probably bouquets of those are not going to be great on the dining room table. So again, grapes with perfect flowers are self-fruitful. We don't have to have 2 types of grapes. Just 1 vine will be enough. And like I said before, some wild types have male and female plants. And the male plants will produce flowers, but never produce fruit. Here's our grape cluster, just to give you some names to things. The rachis is the stem that goes all through it. Here's the shoulder on one side, the wing on the other side, and then the structure of the grape berry. That won't be on the exam. You're okay. And here, just an idea of this grape berry, the skin on the outside. Here's the little pedicel here that attaches it to the vine. And if they're seeded types, there are seeds inside. Grapes like Thompson seedless actually begin with seeds. And as the seed begins to develop, it releases plant hormones, but just that initial burst is enough to get the berry developing, and then the seeds abort. There's great diversity in grapes, from deep purple, almost black, to red, to green, to almost white. Just to be aware, there are lots of different grapes, and we've seen that. When in mature vines, and even more so in young vines, we need to thin out the number of clusters. In the first 2 years, you want to remove any clusters that form, because we need the grapevine to put its strength into growing vines and not growing fruit. Afterwards, we don't want any more than 2 clusters per shoot. And in year 3 and 4, you might consider thinning that to a single cluster per shoot. Doing that will increase the berry size, the sweetness, and the quality. And that should be done right after fruit set, so in the mid-spring. So to reiterate, obtaining vines, we want to get them from a reputable nursery. Although I have to say that grapevines are incredibly easy to propagate. And grapes, we don't have the virus problems with them that we do with raspberries. We don't have the way they're propagated. We don't take root problems with us. So to propagate, you can root cuttings really easily. So you cut the canes to have 3 nodes or 3 buds. You want to put 2 buds below ground and 1 above. And the vines should readily root and grow. It's amazing how easy grapes are to propagate. Now, again, that word of caution about patented material, but if you've got Concord or Beta or Bluebell or Himrod, those are not patent protected, and you can just propagate those as you will. Grapes can also be tip layered. So as you get the shoots in the summer and they hang down, and they'll hang down onto the soil, if you take that tip and keep it out of the soil but bury that shoot just below the tip, it will send out roots into the soil and you'll have a new grapevine. I already talked about that. So check the vines when you get them from a nursery. They should be moist but not moldy. Keep them moist and cool prior to planting, and don't prune the roots generally. Typically, they're going to have small roots, not a huge, big array of roots. So you lay out your vineyard, and I've got some commercial scale photos to show you. So you're going to have to down sample those to your backyard. You can just plant them with a shovel. You don't want to get them too deep. So about the same depth that they were in the nursery. Don't put any fertilizer in the planting hole. Don't put any organic matter or compost or anything in there. Just backfill with the original soil that you took out of the hole. But here's a young nursery that's been planted. You can see the trellises all in place in the drip line, and each bamboo pole is supporting a young grapevine that will grow up that pole and eventually be attached onto the trellis system. And a similar vineyard a little further along, and you see the grapes now are beginning to spread along the trellis system. So in the planting year, our main interest is in growing the root system. We want to have the vine get a good start. It's not necessary to have a post or a trellis. Just a simple stake would be enough. We want to start to train the trunk to grow vertical. Irrigation, of course, is critical in our climate. They have to have plenty of water, and fertilizer is critical. So light applications through the summer of a small amount of largely nitrogen fertilizer. After bud break, you want to prune to the best single cane. We're really only wanting one cane to grow up out of the roots. Rub out any of the other shoots that start coming, and any flower clusters you'd want to rub off as well. And of course, you want to control weeds. And at this age, in the first year, probably your best weed control is either hand weeding or a sharp hoe. And I lean towards the sharp hoe. It'll loosen the soil a little bit as well. Then you need to begin thinking about what kind of a trellis you want your grapes to grow on. There are lots of different kinds of trellises, and if you look at the books on growing grapes, there are lots of different permutations. So you can search online and see what works well for you. I would say, though, that the easiest way to do it is cordon trained. So the trunk comes up, it divides and goes either direction. A single pair of cordons is what you want. I see systems where there's an upper and a lower cordon, but the lower cordon always gets shaded. That doesn't, and I just don't see that system commercially. In the second year, we want to develop a strong and straight trunk, the vertical axis, and we're going to choose the cordons and train those on to the wire. In the third year, we're going to develop the head or the cordons, typically cordons, and we'll grow the canes for the next year's crop. You may get a few fruit, but you want to be really careful about not overcropping in the early years. Now, back to our discussion from the beginning about light. You really need to be thinking as you're deciding how you should trellis your grapes about how you're going to capture the most amount of light. And then, of course, the canes need support. There has to be some kind of a trellis. So here's some examples. We'll start in the upper right-hand corner. This is the Kniffen system. This would be a T trellis in the lower left and a Y trellis at the lower right. And I'll show you some examples of those. So here's a Y trellis without any vines on it. The grapes would be planted between the posts, trained up, and then the canopy is split until it goes each direction over this Y trellis. This is called a California quadrilateral, it's called. And if you think about that, you can see here's the trunk, here's the head. The trunk splits, and then each side goes into two arms. Actually, we're making 4 cordons is what we're doing. So this looks underneath the California quadrilateral, and you can see the 4 cordons, 2 here and 2 here. But look at all the fruit hanging there. That's pretty impressive. And the other thing to note is look how shady it is under there. That's the good news. That means that the grapes are capturing all of the sunlight possible. Just another example of that. And if we look at it from a bird's eye view, on the left, the trunk and head are in the middle, that those two short cordons, and then two on either side with the shoots, canes and shoots coming off of that. And if we look at it from the end, here's the trunk, here's the head, here's the cordons going in and out of the plane of the photo.
Hey, Tara, real quick, we got a couple questions.
Yes.
One from Cynthia here. So I think going back a few slides, this one is wrapped around the base of the new grape trunk. And I'm kind of thinking it might be back to that. Maybe Cynthia, feel free to join in with audio so you can clarify this.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. So
I think if you go back, it's just, I think it was those new vines that were, maybe if we go that
here?
way. Yeah, I think it was those where it's just a small carton or
yeah, it's just a wax paper box that protects the vines after they're planted. Protects them from frost, protects them from critters. We use similar things with fruit trees in commercial settings. If you remember the old waxed paper milk cartons, it's essentially that kind of a
Oh, Cynthia's saying slide 47. So I don't know what slide you're on.
let's see. That is slide 47.
Okay, perfect. And then one question about propagating. You have to bury 2 of the 3 buds when propagating the grapes, and the best time of year to propagate.
The best time would be to take the cuttings about now, so mid spring before bud break, and you can also put them in cans or deep pots. If you've got a protected place that you could put them in, and they'll root in that kind of an environment as well.
And then will roots still grow with only 1 bud buried?
Probably, but the roots are going to come out at the bottom of the cutting, not out of the nodes anyway.
Yeah, and that's a little different than a lot of other plants.
Yes.
And then is a root stimulator recommended?
It wouldn't hurt, but I don't know that it's needed.
My experience with grapes is that it's not necessarily needed. If you're going to use one, I would use a low concentration because they root easily on their own.
Yeah.
And then as far as soil temperature goes, typically things root faster if the soil temperature is warmer, around 70 degrees, or you leave them in the soil a lot longer.
Yeah, a little bottom heat would do. When I was in California, I saw them propagating grapevines. It was really fascinating. They made their cuttings, and keeping track of the orientation, they had a big bin of sawdust, and they took those cuttings that were bundled together in groups of 25 or so and put them upside down so that the top of the cutting was in towards the bottom of the bin of sawdust, and had the tops just barely, the cut end just barely below the surface of the sawdust, and left them for a while. And then root initials would begin to grow because the top of the sawdust bin was warmer than the bottom. So the buds didn't try to break. And then they took them out after a month or so and planted them. So grapes are just really easy to propagate.
All right, thanks, Darryl.
Great. I think this is where we got to. Again, if you look in the books about pruning and training grapes, there are any end of methods of how to do that. But really, it comes down to these 4 main types. Grapevines can be trained either to produce cordons or a head. And for pruning, they can be either spur pruned or cane pruned. So it's a 2x2 matrix, 4 combinations. And that's really all there are. Let me show you some illustrations of what that looks like. So this is spur pruned, head trained, cane pruned, head trained. So no cordons in these 2. Cordon trained, spur pruned, cordon trained, cane pruned. Those are your 4 choices. So this is another permutation on that. It's called fan training. So it's head trained and cane pruned. So how do you decide whether to cane prune or spur prune your grapevine? It really comes down to what type of grapevine you have, and even more importantly, where the fruitful nodes are on the cane. In the Vitis labrusca, usually nodes 2 through 5, sometimes as far as 6, are fruitful. So you leave 2 to 5 cane nodes, plus some renewal spurs with 2 or 3 nodes. And so those are cane pruned. Those could be as long as 8 nodes, actually. In the Vitis vinifera and the hybrids, usually only the basal nodes, at nodes 2 to 3, are fruitful, and so we leave 3 to 4 node spurs, and we call that spur pruning. So that's how you decide. You can, if you pay attention, you could cane prune them and see which nodes produce shoots that are fruitful, and then you know how many buds to leave on your canes thereafter. The mistake that most people make when pruning grapevines is to not prune them enough. Here's the before picture, and that isn't even very busy. This is the after picture. Cane or spur pruned. 1, 2, 3, it's kind of intermediate. We'll call it cane pruned. But notice how little is left. And again, the mistake that we make is to not be hard enough when we prune. So how many buds do we want to leave? Well, the number of buds that remaining is really based on the vigor of the vine. And a way to determine vine vigor is to weigh the prunings. And so you prune your vine about what you think it ought to be. And then you pick up all the prunings and weigh them. Typically, when they're doing this initially, they'll bundle them up with some string and use a spring-type fish scale. And the way this works is you leave 30 buds for the first pound of prunings and then 10 buds for each additional pound of prunings. So in the American grapes, again, it's a 30 plus 10 system, but we don't count renewal spurs. In the vinifera and the hybrids, it's a 20 plus 10 system. 20 buds for the first pound and 10 for each additional pound. They're not quite as vigorous vines. And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg argument. You have to prune it before you know how many pounds of prunings there are. But again, this is just a rule of thumb. This is a place to begin. But overall, probably never want to leave more than 40 buds on a grapevine, not including renewal spurs. And most people leave far more than that. So questions about pruning.
I just wanted to say, Daryl,
Yeah.
I think you're right on that people are scared to cut these things off. But the reality is that if you don't, because grapes only grow flower off of new wood, that new wood continues to get farther and farther away from the root system, and then you get poor and poor quality fruit.
Yep.
So, and it just takes up a whole bunch of yard. So there's a question that just came in: is it better to prune in fall or spring? Grapes need to be pruned in the spring right now. Leave them all long canes over the winter. They winter injure a lot, so don't prune anything until the threat of frost is almost completely gone. That's my recommendation.
Mine too. Grapevine wreaths notwithstanding. Well, fertility, grapes will need an annual application of nitrogen in the spring. Ammonium sulfate or urea is fine. They may need a little additional potassium once they start bearing fruit. Micronutrients are rarely needed for grapes. Grapes don't show a lot of iron deficiency chlorosis. Sometimes they'll get it. They're not immune, but it's not a really common thing in grapes. Tissue testing, if you want to do tissue testing of your grapevine to be sure they have the nutrients they need, it's based on testing the petioles, not the leaves. Now, some problems with grapes. 2,4-D injury is a serious problem. And if you're going to grow grapes, you got to allow some dandelions in your yard. Otherwise, look at this lower right-hand photo, and you get these odd fan-shaped leaves that are kind of crinkled up. You'll see the fruit not setting well. 2,4-D herbicides are just death to grapevines, and it will travel a huge distance. So if your neighbor sprays his dandelions on a hot spring, late spring, early summer day, chances are your grapevines are going to suffer. So just a word to the wise. There are some pests. I talked about grape phylloxera a little bit, grape skeletonizer. I've seen in California, I haven't seen it in Utah. Diseases, powdery mildew on the leaves is pretty common. Downy mildew is common. Botrytis in the bunches can be a problem, but we get less problem with that when the vines are well pruned and if the bunches have been thinned as well. And then birds. Yes, there's a question about birds. The only way that I know of to keep birds out of grapes is to net them. And if you're going to net them, you've got to take the netting and go clear up over, fasten it underneath and fasten the ends. It's got to be completely bird tight. If there's any sort of an opening, the birds will make it in. That's just the only way I know of on a small scale. In orchards and rural areas, they'll use propane cannons. There are scare devices, but none of that works really well in a suburban setting. You could hang old CD discs and as they flutter in the wind, that will scare them. On places like Amazon, you can buy reflective tape and it will offer some protection. But if the birds are hungry and grapes are sweet, they're going to get in and they're going to clean you out. And that's just the simple nature of it.
Yeah, my experience with netting grapes, we net some of the grapes here in the trial just because they'll get completely good to clean, and we want that research. So we found that if we don't tie them really good at the bottom, like completely enclose the whole plant canopy and net around the wire and everything, even then they'll still find places where we didn't do a good job. So they'll still get in, and we have to go through there and look for them periodically because the birds can get caught in there and die. And then nobody likes to see dead birds hanging in the netting. So netting to me is the only effective way to keep birds out. It's the only reliable way to keep birds out, but you have to close all the holes on the ends and on the bottom.
Yeah, I agree. And the reflective stuff is just a deterrent. But netting is the only foolproof way, and it's got to be completely enclosed. We've been going at this about an hour. Do you want to take a break? And we'll come back and talk about raspberries, or do you want to do raspberries and then take a break?
It's hard
Either way.
Hard to hold a vote. I don't know.
What do you think, Mike? Should we keep going, or?
My vote is just to keep going.
Okay, we'll go through raspberries and then we'll take a break. So raspberries, one of the most delightful summer fruits there is. They'll grow most anywhere. They're very well adapted to northern Utah. They don't do great in St. George area. They are a perennial plant like grapes. They're a woody perennial. They're composed of a crown, roots, canes, and the canes can be either primocanes or floricanes. And I'll describe those in the next couple of slides. And then, of course, they have leaves and flowers. So raspberries have a biennial growth and fruiting habit. So individual canes in a raspberry plant will last 2 years, and then they've completed their life, and they need to be cut off and removed from the planting. So the year they come up, so year one, they're primocanes, primo, one, first, primo, and floricanes have flowers. Now, once you've got that all set in your mind, I'll give you the exceptions to the rules. But primocanes in year one, floricanes in year two, and once they have cropped in year two, they need to be cut out of the planting. Here's a diagram showing a raspberry plant. Here's the crown here where roots come out of that. And out of the crown come new canes as well. So we get floricanes to the left and primocanes to the right. Raspberries tend to be pretty shallow rooted. Most of the roots are in the top foot of soil, so they need regular irrigation. They shouldn't be allowed to dry out. Here's the flower of a raspberry, a diagram, and we see we have sepals, petals, stamens inside of that, so the anther and filament, and then in the middle of the flower, there are a number of female flower parts, stigma, style, and ovary, and lots of those. So to show you what the flower looks like again, here's the petals to the outside, stamens, and then inside each one of those is a separate female flower part. So what that tells you is that each knob on the raspberry requires a separate pollination and fertilization event. Well, now we'll get to that. So here's our raspberries, and each little bump on the raspberry is actually a separate fruit. It's called a druplet. And if you think for a minute, the fruit types that are a drupe, that would be the stone fruits, peaches, cherries, plums, apricots. And so each of the little bumps on the raspberry is a druplet, like a tiny little cherry. And the little hairy things that you see poking out from that, and hopefully you have the resolution needed to see that, is the remnants of the stigma and style. So each bump on the raspberry requires a separate pollination and fertilization event. So now every time you go to the grocery store and buy raspberries, you'll be looking through the clamshell to see if you can see the remnants of the floral part. Sorry. Raspberries have two fruiting habits. The first are the summer-bearing raspberries, and these are different genetically. This isn't a management issue. Different cultivars and are summer-bearing, and they fruit on 1-year-old floricanes. And that's what I've been leading you towards. And then there are fall-bearing raspberries, or sometimes called primocane fruiting or ever-bearing. So 3 different names, same type of raspberries, and they bear fruit on primocanes. And we can manage those in one of 2 methods, a 1-crop method or a 2-crop method. And again, the difference between these is genetic. You can buy summer-bearing raspberries or fall-bearing raspberries, and they're different cultivars. I have not found good illustrations of this. These are the best I've been able to find. This is from a nursery in Denmark. So these are for summer-bearing raspberries, so a 2-year process. In the first year, there's my pointer, here starting at the left, our primocanes grow up and they go dormant. And I don't know if you can see this gray dotted line here. That's New Year's Eve, and automatically on New Year's Day, those primocanes become floricanes. In the spring, they'll leaf out, they'll flower, there's fruit on them. We harvest the fruit, and then once we've harvested the fruit, we cut those, what are now floricanes, out of the planting and get them out. In the meantime, we have new primocanes coming up. Now, this primocane coming up really needs to be over here. It's not during harvest that we start to see new primocanes come up. Nevertheless, new primocanes emerge from the soil in year 2, year 1 for them. And then when they're dormant, we'll cut off the top of each cane to encourage side branching. So do you see the process here in the summer-bearing kind? We have primocanes the first year, they're floricanes the second year, they flower fruit, we harvest the fruit, we cut off the cane. In the meantime, we have new primocanes that come up, and in the subsequent year, they will flower and fruit, and then we remove those from the planting. So a 2-year cycle. At any time in a mature planting, we would have both floricanes and primocanes present in the same area of the planting at the same time. So that's summer-bearing raspberries. So for primocane fruiting or fall-bearing raspberries, we can manage them in a 1-crop system. Well, the primocanes come up, and on these raspberries in the fall, usually around late July, they'll begin to flower. And then by mid-August, on the upper nodes of the primocanes, they'll flower and fruit, and we'll get the crop here. And they begin at the top, and as the season progresses, if we have a long late fall, we'll flower quite a ways down that primocane. And then once the canes go dormant, we just cut everything off, cut off all of the canes. The next year, we repeat that, new primocanes come up. In the upper nodes, this apparently was a longer, warmer year than this year. We get fruit further down on the upper nodes. And then once those go dormant, we cut them all off. Simple system. Easy decisions. I cut off all of the canes every year in the late spring, or well, mid-spring, whenever. So that's the one crop system. Then we can take the primocane fruiting and make them just a little bit more challenging. So here's our primocanes that come up going from the left. We get the fall crop on the upper nodes. And then instead of cutting that cane off completely, we cut the cane off just below where the lowest fruit were found. But we don't do that in the summer because they'll fruit until it freezes. So in the dormant season, when there are no leaves on them, we cut those off. There's my cursor. And then in the summer of the next year, we get a summer crop on the lower nodes on the canes that gave us the primocane crop the year before. In the meantime, we have new primocanes that come up. And again, this primocane growth happens over here, not over here. And now we have these primocanes that are growing up, and we'll get the fall crop on those. So 3 methods here. Summer bearing, it's a 2-year cycle. Then the primocane fruiting, it can be a 1-year cycle, just get the fall crop, or a 2-year cycle where we get the fall crop in the fall and then the summer crop on floricanes the next year. So let's take some questions and make sure that you've grasped that, because it's critical to understanding how to prune raspberries.
So Tara, we had a question from Lynette. She says, when pruning the cane after summer fruiting, how tall should you make the cane, and do you prune during the season to keep the branches short?
Is this on summer bearing types?
Yes.
So on summer bearing types, well, I'm going to cover pruning in just a minute, but you want to remove the fruited floricanes in the summer. As soon as you've harvested the berries, get in and cut out the fruited floricanes, because that becomes an entry point for cane and crown borers to get into the plant. So that's a mid to late summer task.
So the question from John is, so do you prune based on the genetic variety of the raspberry or on personal preference? Some of both.
Some of both, yeah. You make your genetic preference when you buy for summer bearing or fall bearing. If you plant summer bearing, there's really only one way to manage those, although we could talk about some odd variations. In the fall bearing world, then you've got 2 choices, the 1 crop or the 2 crop. So this may be a good time to share a story with you. When I worked in Wisconsin, I was the extension fruit crop specialist there, and I got a call from a homeowner. They'd been in a home for 4 or 5 years, and the homeowner called and said, when we bought the house, there were raspberries in the backyard, and they're wonderful, healthy plants, and I never get any fruit. And so I said, well, what kind of raspberries do you have? I don't know. They were there when we bought the house. Okay, that's helpful. How do you manage them? What do you do to them? I cut all the canes off in the dormant season. That's how you manage raspberries, isn't it? So what kind of raspberries were they? They were summer bearing raspberries, and they were cutting off the floricanes. So if you don't know what kind of raspberries you have, it's really an easy task to find out. right now you could go out and cut off all of the raspberry canes down to the ground, and the new primocanes would come up in the summer of 2020. And if you get a fall crop, you have fall bearing raspberries. If you don't, you have summer bearing raspberries, and you should get a crop in 2021. So you got to know which kind you have to know your options for managing them.
All right, thanks, Sarah. That's all the questions that have come in on the chat. So one more. Can you plant summer bearing and fall bearing varieties next to each other?
Oh, you can. There's no problem with one infecting the other, but if you intermingle them, now you have a mess, because then you just have no idea what's what. So if you want to have a row of fall bearing and a row of summer bearing, awesome, but don't intermix them, because that will be awful.
So they're not like fruit trees where you need them to cross-pollinate.
No, raspberries are self-fruitful. In my backyard, I have only autumn Britain raspberries, and we get plenty of crop.
Another question, are summer bearing crops generally more successful than fall bearing because of the weather, or does it really make a difference?
Yeah, along the Wasatch Front, they're equal. In other areas, a couple of weeks ago, I was teaching in Carbon County, and the primocane fruiting raspberries are best there because the floricanes winter killed so badly. But we don't have problem with the floricanes winter killing in Utah County, at least not typically. On a rare winter maybe, but that would be the odd occurrence.
So then when I ask one more, my berries seem to have a brown stem after they fruit, and the floricanes have a green stem. Is this a standard way to know which cane to prune?
Yep, good observation. You're exactly right.
The dead ones are done. They've into their second year.
Yeah, and typically the leaves brown up too, and they're done. It's just get them out.
How tall do you prune the floricanes in preparation for next year's fruit?
I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry. How tall do you prune the floricanes to prepare for next year's fruit?
We're going to get to that in just a minute.
Okay, perfect.
So planting raspberry, you want to plant them in the spring when it's not frosty anymore, about the same height to just slightly lower than they were in the nursery. You want to make sure that you've got plenty of root below ground. So you plant those and you've got this row of sticks and you think, I paid good money for that. Yeah, the sticks are irrelevant. Actually, the sticks are a nuisance. They're just in the way. What you really paid your money for is the crown and these buds that are going to come off of that crown. That's the important part of the raspberry plant. As you might imagine, there are different planting systems for raspberries. They can be planted in hills. There is no law that says that raspberries have to be planted in rows. If you're going to do that, you need those hills to be at least 4 feet apart. But if you think about that for a minute, if you're not locked into planting raspberries in rows, you could put one plant here and one plant there and another plant over there. You could have one in each corner of your yard rather than taking up a big area with a row of raspberries that may not be aesthetically very pleasing. Or they certainly can be planted in rows, in which case you'd put the plants 2 to 3 feet apart and the rows far enough apart that when you're picking one row, you're not getting thorns in your backside from the adjacent row. So let me show you some pictures of what that looks like. A diagram of the hill system. We have a stake and a plant next to it. And over time, you'll get more canes that come up. So that's a nice drawing. What about real life? That's what it looks like in real life. Now, these are planted in a row, hills in a row, but you can be more creative than that. And you can think of ways that you could put hills of raspberries in various places in the yard. And the other advantage to this is you can walk all the way around that hill to harvest. Now, somewhere in the middle of all this, there's a stake or a post, because you can't let the canes flop over, which the floricanes will flop over without some kind of support. Or they can be planted in rows. Again, they need support. This shows a T-post with poly baling twine holding the canes up so they don't tip over. We can get fancier than that. We can put in wooden posts buried deep with wire around the top. We can put cross arms on the posts. We can, if we're going to put wires along that are permanent to the trellis, the canes need to be pulled over and attached to the wire. And one way to do that is to spiral twine around that wire and pull the canes over and attach them to the wire. That is the whole point. So following along with that, you see here the wires to the outside and the floor canes that are painted dark and drawn dark are held to the outside, and we're going to get the primocanes that are not shaded coming up the middle. Now again, you say, well, that's a nice drawing. How does it work in real life? Well, actually it works okay. You can see in this planting, there are floor canes to the outside and primocanes up the middle. So you can do that, but it takes a little attention to detail. Here we come to the pruning questions. So for the summer bearing raspberries, in the summer, we want to remove the fruited floor canes as soon as the last berry is harvested. We also want to thin out the new shoots, and we do that in the summer as well, because it'll put up far more primocanes than we want for the next year. In the dormant season, we head those floor canes by 15 to 25% of their length. So I can't say that we're going to cut those all off at the same uniform height, because the canes are not going to be uniform height. So you want to cut off some off the top of all of those canes. We also want to remove canes that are weak, that are spindly, that are damaged. And in the dormant season, in preparation for the fruiting season that is to come, we don't want to have more than 4 to 6 canes per running foot of row. If we get greedy and we keep 8 to 10, for example, then we do get more berries, but they're smaller. So that's your trade-off. You can keep more canes if you want, but you'll get little, not very great berries. For the primocane raspberries in the single crop system, when it's dormant, we just cut off all the canes and remove them from the planting. In the double crop system, we want to top the fruited canes that are now floricanes just below the node where they fruited last fall, the lowest node, and then we'll get the summer crop on the lower nodes of the floricane. And once they've fruited, then we want to remove those floricanes, get them right out of the planting. And then again, we'll get the primocane crop on the primocanes that have come up that year. So that's pruning. So time for the cartoon. Any idea what happened to my pruning shears? They're ruined. I just hacked my roses to bits with them. It beats me. They didn't cut wire with the darn either. Use good pruning tools when you're pruning. If I could just make one word about pruning tools, the only thing you need to know as you go shopping for pruning tools is to look for one word on the package, and that word is forged. If you buy forged blade pruning shears, they'll last you a lifetime. And I'm thinking, I'm here in my office and I've got my collection of pruning shears, and I can show you what I'm talking about. So here are some pruning shears that my father bought in the late 50s or early 60s. They're Corona brand, but that's irrelevant. There are ergonomically better pruning shears now than these, but after 50 plus years, these blades can be as sharp as any pruning shear because they were good blades. Here's a pair of pruners I bought at a discount store, big box store. They're made out of stamped steel, and they won't hold an edge, and they won't hold up, and they're not worth the money I paid for them. They're garbage. I bought them to demonstrate garbage. Here's a pair of Felco shears. These are hybrid, so the blade, the cutting blade, is forged steel, but the rest of this is cast aluminum. And ergonomically, these are really nice shears, and they'll hold up a good long time. I thought I had some that had a coated blade. You know, if you look on Amazon, you can find all kinds of pruning tools, and you have to be really careful. There are Felco knockoffs that look just like Felco shears, but they're not. If the price is too good to be true, they aren't. So back to pruning raspberries. So again, in the dormant season, we want to take off 20, 25% of the height of the cane. We'll lose a little bit of crop, but we'll get better side branching. The canes will stiffen up. That's just what needs to be done. I'm not really crazy about this illustration. The illustration on the left is completely accurate. I've seen a lot of raspberry plantings that are at least that bushy. The one on the right is overdone, pruned way too much. So let me give you some actual, what does pruning look like? Here's our before picture. And I've seen a lot of raspberry plantings that look like that. There are a lot of canes, too many canes. And that's the after picture. And if you count those, that's about 6, 7 canes per running foot of row. And notice in the left-hand side of the picture, all of the cuttings have been bundled up and then taken out of the planting. So that's pruning fall or summer-bearing raspberries. This young man is pruning fall-bearing raspberries, and this is done midsummer. And this is what he's leaving, about 3 to 4 canes per running foot of row. And that's all that you want to leave. If you leave more canes than that, then you get small fruit. In this case, we've run a rototiller around this row of raspberries. That's a good practice. Either need to run a rototiller around or take a shovel and edge, and anything that's outside of the row needs to be cut off and discarded. And then here are raspberries that have been pruned and rotivated in a commercial setting. Back to fertilizer for a minute. We want 4 to 6 cups of high nitrogen fertilizer per 100 feet of row, done in the early spring, mid-April, and again in late spring and mid-May. And if you've done a good job of site preparation and added phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, then nitrogen should be the only thing that needs to be added in subsequent years.
Carol, real quick, what do you consider a high nitrogen fertilizer? Is like ammonium sulfate?
Yeah, ammonium sulfate or urea, either one.
Urea is really high.
Yeah, urea is really high.
46%.
So you'd want to be on the low end if you're using urea,
Right.
and if you're using ammonium sulfate on the high end.
Right. Thank you.
But again, for whatever purpose you're buying fertilizer, you know, the first number should be a big number, and numbers 2 and 3 generally should be smaller, and the middle number in particular should be small. I think we have to be really careful about the amount of phosphorus fertilizer that we're putting on.
Yeah, as it contributes to algae blooms and the fact that we can create toxic conditions in the soil with too much of it, and that Utah soils typically have plenty.
Yep.
So question came up, how do you manage a uniform row? Mine seems to spread out. Do you transplant in the fall to keep them in an orderly row?
So the way that you keep an orderly row is with a shovel or a rototiller. You delineate where you want your row to be, and then anything that's outside of that row gets dug up and discarded or abandoned, whatever. But it's easy to do with a rototiller. It's harder but doable to do with a shovel. And I would do that in the spring as soon as the soil dries out enough that you can get in and work it. We're a little wet right now, but it won't be long till we'll get a few dry days and you can get in and accomplish that. Just a quick word about harvesting for red, yellow, and black raspberries. Of course, the thimble cap pulls clean, leaving the receptacle on the plant. And in blackberries, the receptacle gets removed along with the fruit. So cultivars. Summer cultivars can be Cascade Delight, Cowichan, Killarney, Reveille, Boyne. Boyne's been around forever. Dr. Black, my colleague, has done some variety trials, and you can find those online. If you go to fruit.usu.edu and rummage around in there a little bit, you can find the results of his raspberry variety trials. Fall bearing, Polka, Polana, Caroline, Autumn Britain or Autumn Bliss, both of those are from Scotland. Anne is a yellow raspberry. Joan J is another fall bearing raspberry. And you should be able to find these at local garden centers and certainly in mail order nurseries. And I think that all of these would do great in Utah County. Now, some things to think about. There are root diseases. If your soil gets too wet, there are root rots. Crown gall has more to do with the site history. There's some fungal wilts. I've talked about virus diseases, raspberry bushy dwarf virus in particular. Insects, they're cane and crown borers. If you don't keep the fruit picked off, there are little picnic beetles that will get in between the receptacle and the thimble fruit. And so if you aren't careful, if you're out harvesting and eating, you'll pick that raspberry off and pop it into your mouth, and you'll get a little extra protein with that raspberry. They're not very tasty. But if you've done a good job, you should get some raspberries, actually a lot of raspberries that look something like that. So questions about red raspberries before we go, well, red yellow raspberries before we go on to talk about blackberries. Let's talk about blackberries for a while. So blackberries, of course, are just cousins to raspberries. They are like summer bearing raspberries, not like fall bearing raspberries. If you look in the nursery catalogs, though, you will see some primocane fruiting blackberries. See Prime Jim, Prime Jan, and there's another one, the name I can't remember. But these have biennial canes like summer bearing raspberries. They're more heat tolerant, and they're more tolerant of alkaline soils, and they're pretty happy in Utah overall. There are many, we can divide blackberries up in a number of different.
You know what, Terrell, I'm sorry. There were a couple of questions that came in during the break.
Oh,
if you don't mind.
I'm sorry. Let's stop and take those.
I spaced that off. I was answering one by typing, and then a question about raspberry. Let's have a 12 by 6 foot raspberry patch. Last early summer, the leaves of one cane had yellow spots. I dug out the cane, and it didn't appear on any other canes. What was that?
That's a good Marion Murray question.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. Sounds like it was yellow spots.
Yeah.
And then what's your take on secondary water as far as algae blooms?
Well, secondary water, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It has two potential problems. One is salinity and the other is alkalinity. Raspberries will deal with the alkalinity better than the salinity. And there's really nothing we can do about either problem. If you get iron chlorosis, iron deficiency chlorosis, then you can add iron, chelated iron. But the salinity, it just is what it is. And I don't know of any way around it.
Right. So with secondary water, does that tend to change alkaline problems in the soil? I think probably address that. It doesn't typically change alkalinity in the soil.
No, our soils are so highly buffered that we can't change the pH.
And then irrigating raspberries from John, they typically irrigate once a week. Do they need more frequent watering than that?
I would think in midsummer they're going to need more water than once a week, twice a week probably.
So that's what I would say too. All right, I think that's all the current questions in the queue.
Super.
Thanks,
I'm glad
Harold.
you're asking questions, and I hope we're giving you the information that you want to learn. Blackberries they have various abilities to stand up. There are erect blackberries, semi-erect and trailing. The stems can be thorny or thornless, although in general, the thornless blackberries are less hardy than the thorny ones. The hardiness of blackberries, of course, depends on the cultivar. If I were going to choose a blackberry, I would choose Triple Crown. It's pretty much a winner here. It's pretty easy to grow. Some of these, the Cheyenne, Shawnee, Cherokee, Arapaho, are not as winter hardy. They came out of a USDA breeding program in Oklahoma. And then the trading types are the least hardy. Blackberries do need some kind of a trellis, something to hold them up. They also need to be topped. If there's anything that needs to be done in blackberries, the most important cultural practice in blackberries is to tip those canes in the dormant season, because that will promote the side branching, and that's where the fruit are born. Now, I want to tell you about a situation I become familiar with in Cedar City. And this couple, they're a retired couple, and this picture is taken looking north, so south behind the picture taker. And if you look at the trellis system, the important parts of the trellis are the vertical posts and the 4 wires that are used. Actually, they're using cable, I think. And you'll notice there are 4 cables. And you see in this picture, in these 2 hills, there is, and these are the fluorocanes, and one fluorocane is trained to wire number 1, and the other fluorocane is trained to wire number 3. Later this year, they'll select 2 primocanes that will grow up. A low one will be trained on wire 2, and a high one will be trained on wire 4. And you can see in both cases that those canes have been tipped, and that has encouraged the side branching. This is what it looks like in midsummer. The brown canes are the fluorocanes, and in this instance, they're using wires number 2 and 4 for the fluorocanes, and wires number 1 and 3 for the primocanes. So we've got an upper fruiting wire and a lower fruiting wire. And the picture on the left really shows for the slower wire, this has been pruned off and the arms are going both directions. And here are blackberries that are maturing. And if you look really close here in the back of that picture, you can see the bird netting. And that's really the purpose for the upper horizontal bars on the trellis that you can see here. That they cover this with bird netting to keep the birds out of them. And that's the only way that they've found they can be successful. The other thing to tell you is that they suppress the primocanes, and they do that just by pinching them off until mid-June. And that's when they select the 2 canes that will become the primocanes, that will be the fluorocanes the next year and bear fruit. And they claim they get heavy crops off of just these 4 hills of blackberries on the south side of the driveway. It's really pretty good horticulture. With blackberries, you need to be really careful to allow the fruit to stay on the plant until it is ripe. It will turn black before it's ripe. So color isn't necessarily the telling factor. It's the ease of removal force. And if you have to really pull on it, chances are that blackberry is going to be pretty tart. There's some other brambles. They're yellow raspberries, and these are just color sports of red raspberries. They're essentially red raspberries. They're most commonly fall-bearing type, but you manage them the same as red raspberries. There are black raspberries. These are a different species. They're all summer-bearing. They're less hardy than the reds, more thorny than the reds. And in my experience, the fruit are small, and the flavor is no better than reds. They don't like summer heat. I had an uncle that lived down in Vineyard when I was a kid that had some of these, and I didn't think they were very great then, and my opinion hasn't changed over the years. There are purple raspberries that are hybrids between red raspberries and black raspberries, but I have a hard time getting really excited about these as well. These are summer bearing. And then there are all kinds of hybrids, and these mostly were bred in cool climates, and they don't take heat very well. So loganberries, tayberries, boysenberries, youngberries, lullaberries. These are just hybrid raspberries. So that's what I have about raspberries, and this is the transition time when we're changing from raspberries to strawberries. So questions as we finish up raspberries and blackberries?
There hasn't been anything that's come through on the chat so far. One just about watering. Is it best to water from the ground, or is overhead watering okay?
Um, I don't know. I water mine overhead and they seem to do okay. Um, suppose it's always better to get it onto the ground. Certainly raspberries can be drip irrigated, but I use just overhead sprinklers on mine and they're fine.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. They don't seem to mind too much. And then there's a couple others here. I'm going to take them out of order because that'll help. So what does tipping mean?
Yeah, tipping is to remove the top part of the cane,
Just top few inches,
or 3 or 4.
right?
Yeah.
3 or 4 inches. And then what time of year are those to be tipped?
Dormant season.
So like this time of year.
And raspberries now, dormant season. In
Blackberries.
blackberries, you want to do that to the primocanes
In the growing season.
in the growing season. Yeah,
So that they branch out, and then when they turn into floricales the second year, they produce more flower clusters.
correct.
Let's see what else. So it's there's a question here. I think he meant topped. Topping, tipping. I guess in that sense is kind of the same thing.
Same idea. Yeah.
Take the first few inches off. All right, and then you mentioned triple crown as blackberry that's good to grow here. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, I think that clarifies all of the chat messages that have come through.
Excellent. Let's go on to strawberries. In contrast to the plants that we talked about so far, strawberries are an herbaceous perennial. Crown is really the perennial portion of the plant, and out of the crown come leaves, stolons or runners, roots, and flower trusses that will produce fruit. So we see here we have the crown and roots coming out of the crown, and here's the leaves and stolon and trusses coming out of the crown as well. And crowns can have branch crowns, but an interesting thing about crowns is they only grow one direction. They only grow up. They don't grow down. They're not like carrots. They only grow going up. The right panel is to show you that strawberries are shallow rooted. Most of the roots are going to be in the top 6 inches of soil. They don't explore a large volume of soil looking for water, so they need to have regular irrigation. Here's our strawberry crown. You see the roots are coming out here, and any new roots that are produced will come up higher on the crown. And that's important because it tells us how deep the strawberry plant should be planted. And when we get talking about renovation, you'll understand why that's important. Here's our strawberry flowers. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary flowers, and they open in succession through the season. The primary fruit is typically the largest, and then size goes down over time. So here's our matted row raspberries, and the stolons come out, and the daughter plants set at are produced at the second node along the stolon or runner. Strawberry flower. We have here sepals, petals, stamens, and then on the inside, way on the inside, we have the receptacle, and then a number of female flower parts, stigma-style ovary, that are attached to the receptacle. So that should sound familiar to you with raspberries. And if we look at the photo, here's the receptacle in the middle. Well, let's start from the outside. Sepal, petal, stamens, and then we have a whole bunch of female flower parts attached to the receptacle, and the receptacle is the part that we eat. So for each seed on the outside of the strawberry, that requires a separate pollination and fertilization event. Now let me show you, in a second I'll show you why that's important. I've got to get my other screen scrolling down to where I am. Okay, so in this picture of the strawberry flowers, you can see petals, stamens, and then the multiple female flower parts in the middle of the flower. Now look carefully at these two raspberry or strawberry images. The one on the left is normal and even, and if you look at the arrangement of the achenes on the outside of the strawberry. See the perfect symmetry. Beautiful, isn't it? Then look at the one on the right. Yeah, that one's not so beautiful. But if we look at some of the achenes, this one, 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 you see that the receptacle is swollen underneath those achenes. And if we look right in here, you'll see that the achenes have not swollen, and nor has the receptacle tissue beneath. So what probably happened here is that these achenes that are sunken probably didn't get pollinated or fertilized, and so those seeds are not developing. The seeds that are developing are rich sources of plant hormones, primarily auxin, and as the auxin is released from those seeds, that causes the receptacle to grow and swell and become the beautiful strawberry that we want to eat. Well, that's enough about that. So there are 3 fruiting habits for strawberries. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them. The first are the June bearers. And in the June bearing strawberries, we get a single crop a year. The flower buds on June bearing strawberries are produced in the fall in response to short days and cool nights, usually either side of Labor Day. And then the next year they flower, they fruit. And then that fall, new flower buds are formed and the cycle repeats itself. In the everbearers, we get 2 crops per year, and they get a spring crop and then a later summer crop. There are only a couple of cultivars for that, and frankly, they're not very good. Then there are day neutral strawberries. They're sometimes called everbearers, but they're not. The day neutral, you get 2 to 3 crops per year, and they'll come in waves in succession. And they're day length insensitive. They'll produce flower and fruit in flushes. I need to tell you a little story about day neutral strawberries. These have a Utah connection. The day neutral characteristic was discovered by Dr. Royce Bringhurst, who is a USU alumnus. He grew up in the big metropolitan area of Benyon, Utah, about 62nd south in Redwood Road in Salt Lake County. Again, he attended USU, got a bachelor's degree in agronomy, and then went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he earned a degree in plant breeding, and then was hired as a strawberry breeder by the University of California at Davis. So apparently, as the story goes, Dr. Bringhurst was home in the summer for whatever reason, and was hiking in up the top of one of the Cottonwood Canyons. Not clear if it was Big or Little Cottonwood Canyon. And I mean, the man's a strawberry breeder, so he's looking around and he's seeing strawberries, and they're either flowering or fruiting when they ought not to have been flowering or fruiting. And he thought that was kind of odd. And so he collected some of those plants, took them back to California with him, discovered that they were not responsive to day length, and incorporated that into his breeding program. And now that's the basis for strawberry industries in California, Florida, and really all the warm season production areas in the world. So that has a Utah connection. Now, I met Dr. Bringhurst early in my career, nicest man in the whole world, just kind and gentle, and always had a smile on his face. And part of that was because he's just a nice man, but part of it was that all of those strawberry cultivars that California released were patented, and Dr. Bringhurst got a little piece of every strawberry plant that was sold in California for a number of years. But his estate was kind, and they made a donation to USU, and now we have a graduate fellowship in his name in our department.
Tara, one clarification.
Yes.
You mentioned that the everbearing strawberries weren't very good. Is that referring to taste, or just
and yield? See, Ozark and Fort Laramie are the only two cultivars of everbearing, so-called everbearing strawberries. They're hard to find. You won't find them in local nurseries typically. And in terms of production, you'll get a lot more out of the day neutral types than you would out of either of those cultivars.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So we plant them in the spring when the danger of frost is past. We'll talk about the proper depth in just a minute. We'll spread the roots and firm the soil tightly around the crown. It's important to get strawberries in at the right depth. If we get them too shallow with the entire crown out of the soil, again, where are new roots going to arise? Above the other roots. If we get them too deep, the crown will be smothered if it's completely in the soil. So we want the crown halfway in the soil and halfway out of the soil. So it's the Goldilocks principle, not too deep, not too shallow, but just right. So I'll just show you about how to plant strawberries. On the left panel here, if I can find my cursor, this is a bundle of strawberry plants I bought at a local nursery. This is my wife opening a hole with a trowel and putting the roots down in, just planting them. And the left panel here shows the plant as it's beginning to grow. The middle panel here shows planting with a shovel. Put the shovel in and pull the dirt away, leaving that crevice opening, putting the plant, holding the crown so that it will be at the soil height, and then pushing the soil back in around the crown. So the right picture shows the crown part way out of the soil and part way in the soil. And you think, oh, I paid good money for that. And yes, you did, but it won't take long before the new leaves emerge and you'll have a nice looking strawberry plant like that.
Tara, one quick question before you move on to irrigation. You mentioned that sometimes, this is a question from John, you mentioned that sometimes the day neutral are labeled as everbearing. Are there specific day neutral types to look for in case they're mislabeled?
In terms of the day bearing cultivars, it's sort of like, or day neutral cultivars, it's sort of like raspberries. It's a genetic thing. And so at the end, I have some cultivars, and I can give you some names of cultivars that are day neutral cultivars. Is that the question?
I think so. And then Laura asks, do you have a favorite strawberry cultivar for here in this area?
We'll talk about that when we talk about cultivars.
Gotcha.
So again, strawberries are shallow rooted, so they have to receive regular irrigation. And it also speaks to weed control. They don't compete with weeds well. So we need to keep the weeds at bay. And a sharp hoe is the best weed implement in a strawberry patch. There are lots of different ways to plant strawberries, but I've tried to simplify it down to two methods. The matted row system, in this system we set plants 12 to 18 inches apart in a row and allow the beds to get 12 to 18 inches wide. We encourage runners. We remove flowers during the first year to encourage runner development. And in this system, yield is most closely related to the number of daughter plants that you can get to set. And this is the system that's most commonly used for June-bearing strawberries. The spaced plant system, the plants are set closer together, 6 to 8 inches apart. We maintain a single plant row. Runners are removed, and we keep the flowers in the year of planting. And in this system, the yield is most closely related to the number of branch crowns, not daughter plants, since we don't allow any daughter plants. And this is best adapted for warmer areas and for day neutral cultivars. We'll talk first about the matted row system. It's a diagram of a matted row. We can see the mother plants and then daughter plants that are spread around. And this is a photo of a matted row system strawberry planting in the Midwest. And this is a really nice planting. There's no weeds. The rows are about 15 inches wide. Great planting. So in year one, the planting year, we're going to plant them in the early spring. We'll give them some nitrogen fertilizer to get them well underway. Want to irrigate them frequently, a couple of times a week to promote the runners pegging, the roots coming out of the daughter plants. We're going to remove the flowers in this first year, and we're going to weed by cultivation and by hand. And then we're going to put winter mulch on these plants after the growing season. We'll talk about that in just right now. Winter mulch, the best winter mulch is straw, about 2 to 3 inches of clean straw. You want to put it on once there's just a little bit of frost in the soil about Thanksgiving, and then remove them in the spring, just as you start to get new leaves that emerge, which would be about now. Another alternative would be spun bonded polyester row covers. And you can buy these online or in some of the better garden centers as well. Let me give you some photos of what that looks like. So strawberry plantings covered with straw in preparation for winter. And then again, this time of year, we're going to remove the straw and let the new leaves emerge. And then we want to put that straw between the rows. There are a bunch of reasons to do that. But I need to comment here that using straw in strawberry production, that isn't where the name strawberry came from. It probably came from the word strew, because they strew themselves across the soil like a farmer would spread straw. And so they have the common origin, strewberries spreading straw. So that's the origin of the name. This is an example of row covers covering a planting of strawberries. And you see along the edge, they have sandbags down to keep the row cover down, because if you get wind under it, it will lift it up. At home, though, you can use, now I'm wrong place. So now we're into year 2 in the matted row. So in the early spring, we're going to remove the mulch to the row middles. We're needing to frost protect. We'll talk about that in just a minute. We'll harvest our crop in late May and into June. That'll be the first crop. And then we'll renovate in preparation for subsequent years. And that's when we're going to control the weeds, and then we'll put out mulch in the fall. So strawberries tend to flower pretty early in the spring. And it's pretty easy to tell the happy flowers from the unhappy flowers after a cold night. So for frost protection, again, back to site selection, that's really important. But then in a home garden situation, tarping is the easiest way to do that. So you can just cover the planting with a tarp, like those blue poly tarps you buy at the hardware store, and way down the edges, so if there's a breeze, it doesn't get under it. The earth all the time is radiating heat out into the atmosphere. And if you can insulate that a little bit, hold that in around the plants, you'll keep them above freezing. And we're trying to keep them above about 30 degrees. And you'll be amazed at how much heat just a thin tarp can hold in. So after we harvest our first berries, we need to begin to renovate. And the renovation process, we're going to control weeds. We're going to narrow the rows. We're going to try to flip some soil around the crowns, incorporate the mulch. And this is the time we're going to fertilize, not in the early spring, except in the planting year. Now, these are on the left are commercial scale photos. You see the rotavator going down through the row, and he's flipping soil everywhere. But the rows are kept narrow because of how far apart the tines are in the rotavator. But that soil flipping will flip some of that soil in around the crowns, so that as they grow ever higher, we're going to mound soil up a little bit, maybe 1/4 of an inch, to give some new soil for new roots to emerge into. On the right is a more home garden scale situation, again, running the rototiller up on either side, and hopefully some of the soil will flip over into the row. Now, yield in strawberries is more closely related to the linear feet of row edge than it is to the square feet of surface area covered. So I want you to envision in your mind a strawberry patch that's 10 feet by 10 feet, so 100 square feet. Yeah. And that could be solid strawberries. And the thing, you would think in your mind that if we covered that whole surface area with strawberries, that's how we're going to get the highest yield. In actuality, if you took that 10 feet and you made 3 rows, you would get higher yield and better quality fruit. And the reason for that is you actually get an arch of leaves. So you're getting photosynthesis on the sides as well as on the top. So I strongly recommend maintaining strawberries in rows rather than this solid, massive patch of strawberries. Weed management. Weeds are by far and away the most significant pest of strawberries. They compete for water, for light, for nutrients. And like I said before, the best control is a sharp hoe and a strong back. And sometimes that's best accompanied by a weak mind that describes me as I'm off weeding my strawberry row. In fertility, if you added phosphorus and potassium before planting, then the only fertilizer you need to add is nitrogen. And we don't want to put that on in the spring. We want to put that on at renovation. If you put on a heavy application of nitrogen on strawberries in the spring, you get a lot of leaves and you don't get fruit. So in the year one, when the runners are forming, we're going to put on 3/4 to 1/2 pound of ammonium sulfate or 1/2 to 1/3 of a pound of urea per 100 feet of row. And then in subsequent years, at renovation and then a month later, 1/2 pound of ammonium sulfate or 1/3 of a pound of urea per 100 foot of row. And those are granular fertilizers, so you need to water them in. But you can gauge that. If you're giving them too much nitrogen, you'll get a lot of leaves and you won't get the fruit that you want. Now, you may think after I'm done renovating and it looks like this, you think I've killed my planting. But if you turn on the irrigation, they'll come back and they'll look pretty great in just a couple of weeks. Now, let me do a little comparison here. So in the matted row, the advantages are it's low planting cost because we're not having to put so many plants out. It's really well adapted to cool climates. Disadvantages are weed management because we've got this mat of plants. We do get declining yield over time because we'll keep it for several years. Soil-borne pathogens are pretty common, and harvest can be a little more difficult because we've got this mat of strawberries. So if we go on to the spaced plant system now, this is really developed for warm climates, and Utah County probably is kind of intermediate between a warm climate and a cool climate, and it compensates for poor runnering. So in this system, the runners are removed. In California, it's used as an annual system, so they're often only kept for a single year, but they can be kept for more than 1 year. So advantages, weed control is easy. They're easy to harvest. The fruit are cleaner, and they're better for warm areas. And I remember now that I didn't complete my thought when I was talking about putting the straw between the rows in the matted row system. The reason to put the straw between the rows, it keeps weeds down, it keeps mud down, it keeps water in the soil. And the other thing is the strawberry flower trusses, they come straight up in the spring, but then as the fruit gets heavy, they lay over and the fruit would lay in the mud. And so the straw keeps the fruit off of the mud. Now back to the space plant system. The disadvantage are it's higher to establish because you have to buy more plants. If you use plastic, you have to get rid of that. It doesn't work really well in cold climates. Let me show you some pictures of a space plant system. This is in plastic, but again, it wouldn't have to be a single row system. This is also in plastic, but it wouldn't have to be. This is strawberry production as practiced in California, a space plant system. They make these raised beds and cover them with plastic, then holes are punched through the plastic and the plants are set by hand through the plastic. And that's what it looks like during the growing season. You can see there are some runners, but obviously with plastic they can't set. So cultivars. In June bearing, if you have to have the earliest strawberries in your neighborhood, Early Glow is your berry. Jewel and Sparkle have probably the best flavor. If you're after flavor, Jewel and Sparkle is what you would want. They've been around a long, long time. They're very reliable. The only drawback to Jewel and Sparkle is that fruit size tends to be small. On the day neutral side, Seascape, Tribute, EV2, and Albion are considered the best. EV2 is the latest and greatest. I've got Seascape at my house, and they do pretty well in Cache Valley. So I think that's what I've got for you in strawberries. So there are questions about strawberries.
So one question came in are they preferred by deer?
Uh,
Do deer like strawberries?
Oh, do deer like strawberries? I haven't had problem with deer browsing my strawberries over the winter. How did they get them during the summer? They did, and so I had some netting, and I actually just put it over the top, and that discouraged them. Yes, deer will eat the strawberry plants.
So what about growing strawberries in containers?
They can be grown in containers in an annual system. I wouldn't recommend trying to hold them over, depending on the size of the container, because the whole pot can freeze during the winter and damage the plants. I see these really cute terracotta strawberry plants that have got the little cups coming out on each side, and I have to admit they're really cute, but it's kind of a gimmick. I've not ever seen those work really well, primarily because it's hard to get enough water into those to get the upper soil wet enough, and then you're drowning the lower ones. So I'm not really keen on planting them in pots. I've also seen these 3-tier round circle things, and I think those are a mess as well. How do you reach in and get the fruit on the upper tier? So I'm not really crazy about those.
Next question is, so do we not allow fruit the first year?
In the Matador system, you remove the flowers the first year. In the spaced plant system, you keep the flowers the first year.
And then from Amber, she says the previous owner of our house planted strawberries at the base of the peach tree. Will that affect the growth of either plant?
Well, the biggest problem in planting strawberries at the base of the peach tree is that the peach will shade the strawberries. So you won't get the production that you want because they're growing in a shady environment. So I wouldn't do that.
Okay. And then from John, in a Matador system, if fruit yield declines over the years, do you eventually replace the plants?
Yeah, the fruit size and yield will decline over time. And so about every 4 to 5 years, you need to find a new place to have your strawberry patch, buy new plants from a nursery and set you up a new plant and plant something else where the strawberries were.
And that's largely because they're so prone to root diseases and problems that build up in the soil over time.
Correct.
Okay, that's all the questions that are currently in the queue.
Great. We have well, actually, you were sent the Strawberries in the Garden, so you have that publication. We'll finish up talking about bush fruit, and I include all these together, the gooseberries, currants, both black, and red, and white, Juneberries, serviceberries, and blueberries. And I've grouped these together largely because the pruning is the same. The structure of the plants is also the same. So these are all woody perennials. The crown below ground is the business part of that plant. And then out of that crown, we have roots and canes that come out. And the fruit are borne on the canes along with leaves. Plant them in the spring when we're past hard frosts. Typically, these are bought potted. You can certainly buy the mail order bare root. Plant them about 3 to 4 feet apart. Make sure that if you have potted material like you would plant ornamentals, you want to cut through the root ball so that the roots will spread out and don't spiral, and then get water on them immediately after you plant them. Pruning is the real common factor here. We practice renewal pruning. And in renewal pruning, we remove the oldest 3 to 5 canes, and maybe more. And we're going to thin out any weak, spindly canes, because the objective here is we want to keep the canopy from becoming dense or busy. We want to have enough canes to get fruit, but not enough so that we don't get good air movement through that canopy. So let me show you some pictures of what that looks like. This is before. Those are pretty busy plants. And these are the after pictures. And these are, I think, are both black currant bushes. But you see, we left very few canes compared to what was there before. And that's about where they need to be. Let's talk more particularly about currants and gooseberries. These are both in the Ribes genus. These are not as popular as they used to be. Gooseberries are thorny. You see in the picture to the far right, you can see the pictures there. And notice on the fruit, the opposite the stem, there are remnants of the flower parts, and they're crunchy and not very good. And you have to take time to rub those off. That's just more time consuming than most people want to do. They're typically used in cooking. My aunt used to make gooseberry pie that was to die for. But currants, the red and white currants are like red and yellow raspberries. They're just, it's a recessive trait to get white. The black currants are a different species. Must be questions, Mike.
Yeah, real quick. Couple going back to strawberries.
Okay.
In a matted row system, excuse me, and then I missed from John added to his comment, would elderberries be part of bush fruits?
Yes.
And then would you recommend using matted rows or spacing method for strawberries for homeowners?
Would I recommend the matted row or space plant,
Yeah.
one or the other?
Which one? Yeah.
It depends on what kinds of strawberries you're going to plant. If you're going to plant June-bearing strawberries, I would use the matted row. If I were planting day neutral, I would use the spaced plant.
Okay. And then John asks, when pruning, do you just snip them off right down at the base?
Yes, you want to cut as low as you can.
Okay. All right, that's the questions we have.
Great. So these ribes, they do best in good soils. They need adequate light. They won't do well in the shade. They need regular irrigation like you would with any fruit crop. But the advantage of these is they're really winter hardy. They're hardy into zone 2, I think. But they are pretty heavy nitrogen feeders. So adding organic matter to the soil before you plant them is always beneficial. And then about a quarter cup of a high nitrogen fertilizer per plant each year. And if you're not getting the kind of vigorous cane growth that you want, give them more nitrogen and goose them along a little bit. That'll help them. So some comments about the fruit. You see on the currants here, the remnants of the floral parts, mostly used for jelly. These are black currants in the upper right-hand corner. They have a very unusual, distinct flavor. Some people have described it as a loathing and stinking savor. My former colleague at Wisconsin described it as tasting like dirty sweat socks. I didn't ask him how he knew that, but he had teenage boys at home at the time. I suppose that's how he knew. But you can see on the gooseberries the thorns here, so you may want to pick those with welder's gloves. If you do make jelly out of currants, you don't need to put pectin in. You extract the juice out of them in a steam juicer, add the appropriate amount of sugar and bring that to a boil, and you boil it so long. And then you better get it into your jelly jars in a quick hurry or it'll set up in the pan. So some cultivars in currants, Red Lake and White Imperial have been around forever, and they're really good cultivars. Black currants, any of those are equally good. And the gooseberries, Pixwell and Poor Man have been around a long time, and they're perfectly good gooseberries. Blueberries, and I have to admit, I'm here to be discouraging about blueberries. I'll try to give you some hints about how you might be successful, but blueberries are just not adapted to where we live. They like acidic soils. We don't have acidic soils, only in a few places. And if you think about what was in Utah County 10,000, 15,000 years ago, it was under 200 or 300 feet of water with Lake Bonneville. And for however many thousand years Lake Bonneville was there, organisms lived in that water and they died and settled to the bottom, and their skeletons or shells were calcium carbonate, and that's broken down into our soil. Our soils have high levels of calcium carbonate, which buffers our soils, which means that we really can't change the pH on them. Blueberries are not fully winter hardy in Utah. Some of the half-highs would be, some of the most hardy types certainly will survive here. So, and then every time you turn on the tap, to irrigate your blueberries, you're adding alkalinity to that system. So whatever you've done to make the soil acidic, you're overcoming that every time you irrigate. So just in terms of soil preparation, if you're going to do that, add copious amounts of organic matter. Peat moss would be a really good source of organic matter. You can add sulfur to the soil, although I don't know that it will really do any good. A 1/4 pound per square foot and incorporate that in. Those reactions are microbe mediated. The soil has to be wet in order for that to happen. There are thiobacteria that make their living breaking down sulfur, and as part of that process, they release acid into the soil. But our soils, again, are so buffered that it's really hard to make that happen. Then cultivate that soil regularly to make it very loose and friable and get the drainage good. So if you got to do that, another way to grow blueberries, I call it the excavate and replace method. So you excavate a large volume of soil, say a bushel or more, so 3 feet across and a couple of feet deep. And in that hole, you fill the hole up with peat moss and plant your blueberry into the peat moss. And the illustration here is to show that the blueberry grows better in peat moss than it will in native soil. And I've seen that happen, and that is true. But again, every time you water into that peat moss, which is acidic when you put it in, you're adding alkalinity to that system. So it's not a long-term solution. So in California, they're just saying, well, we're not going to deal with the soil. It's alkaline. We can't change it. So we're just going to make a windrow of organic matter and plant them in the organic matter, and we'll provide everything they need there. The problem we have in Utah County is we get winter, and that whole windrow would freeze and the crown would probably be damaged, particularly in cold winters. Let me show you some pictures of blueberry production. This is in Kern County, California. See the windrow of organic matter here, but notice the drip lines. And in this farm, they have a sulfur burner that generates sulfuric acid, and that gets injected into the drip line. So every time they're irrigating, they're acidifying the water. You'll also notice that these berries have kind of a grayish cast to them. That's because they've been sprayed with a clay product called Surround to prevent or reduce sunburn, sun scald problems. And you'll notice in the lower right-hand picture, the overhead sprinklers that mist these berries to keep them cool in the summer. And so I asked the question, what do blueberries cost at Costco? I think economically, it's just a whole lot cheaper to buy berries than it is to try to grow them here. So just to give you some idea how blueberries are grown, where they're happy, you see rows of blueberries, and their bushes, they'll get 5-6 feet tall. The lower left shows them growing in a raised bed with weed barrier fabric over them. The flower, the petals are fused to form a corolla. The best pollinators are bumblebees. Honeybees tend to gnaw holes in the side and go in and steal the nectar. So if you just have to grow blueberries, well, I'll comment on that later. The best bet, if you're in a cold area, would be the half-high cultivars. These were produced at the University of Minnesota, and they're short-statured. They're also pretty cold hardy. So North Sky, North Country, North Blue, Polaris, Northland, Chippewa, and St. Cloud. For the standard high bush cultivars, Patriot, Bluetta, Jersey, Blue Crop, and Blue Ray. And I have to grin every year. I go to the big box store nurseries and I see blueberries for sale, and I shake my head and say, well, I suppose this is really great business for you. You have great return patronage to these because people buy them, they take them home and plant them, and they die. And next year they come back and buy another plant and it dies the next year too. Blueberries are just not happy in our climate and with our soil and with our water. Let me finish up just one more slide, couple more slides, and then I'll take questions across this whole group. So there are native fruits. Choke cherries are native in the mountains. Service berries are native here. There are western elderberries that are native here. Buffalo berries out in the Uinta Basin. Huckleberries in the mountains above the highest level that Lake Bonneville was. Now, a couple of words of caution. These would be pruned like the other bush fruits, with the exception of choke cherry. They're just kind of little trees, depending on, on your choke cherry type. You want to get materials that are native to the West. We had a bunch of service berries that came from a breeding program in Saskatchewan, and they all were yellow midsummer because they were deficient in iron. So the Western materials are adapted to our alkaline soils, and they don't get the iron chlorosis. Most of these are most useful for juice or for jelly, not for fresh eating, with the exception of huckleberries. They're definitely for fresh eating. But no one's going to tell you where the huckleberries are. Those are closely held family secrets. And if you discover them, more power to you. So just to review, if you choose a good site and prepare your site well, then choose an appropriate species and a good cultivar of that. And then for the cultivar, use the system and work the system and pay attention to them. You should have good success. So let's stop and take some questions, and that's the end of what I have.
So Terrell, question from Laura is, geographically, where do blueberries tend to prefer the native geography?
Yeah, blueberries are native to the eastern seaboard. They were, I'm looking for a word, domesticated. That's the word I want, in New Jersey and Maryland. And so they're native to that area, up into Michigan, northern Indiana, across there. Those soils tend to be acidic. There's lots of rainfall, and they're very happy there. There are also low bush blueberries that are native to Maine and the maritime provinces of Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, those areas. And they grow very well in the Pacific Northwest, but they're not native to the Pacific Northwest.
One other question, is it possible to grow huckleberries in alpine, I would just say Utah County generally?
Well, the problem you'll run into even in alpine is you're still in the bed of Lake Bonneville, and so the soils are going to be alkaline and highly buffered.
Question from John, with bush fruit, is it similar to other berries in that you don't let them flower for the first 1 to 2 years?
Yeah, I probably would remove any flowers at least the year of planting, and then in the second year, I'd try to pay attention, and if there are a lot of flowers, I would reduce the crop, because you need to get that bush to grow, and there's just competition between vegetative growth and fruit growth.
So let the roots grow out and develop before it puts energy into the fruit system.
Yes.
Well, I am grateful for Terrell for doing this. I thought this was excellent. I think we do miss some of that socialization. I've seen some comments coming in on that, but this is a good workaround for the current situation. Another question from John: do you need 2 plants, male and female, with any of them? I'm assuming any of the bush fruits.
I don't think so.
I can't think of any from my experience with it. I think they're all pretty self-fruitful.
Yeah, and they're perfect. Yeah, the only one of the other small fruits that I didn't talk about that you need male and female plants would be hardy kiwi. So
And the word hardy is kind of a misnomer.
Yeah, I don't recommend the hardy kiwi. They're only about this size anyway.
Right.
And they're just not all that great. If you're growing pistachios, which don't, they have male and female plants. But yeah.
Okay. Well, fantastic.
Great.
Yeah, that turned out really well. I'm really happy for that. We'll shoot for next week as well, guys, and I'll send out an invite for that. And again, thanks to Terrell. And I'll sign off. And then Terrell is also teaching the evening class. If there's portions that you missed and you want to log on to that one, you're welcome to do so. But I have recorded this particular class. So thanks, guys. I'm going to go ahead and end now.